All right, perfect. Hi, everybody. Hello. Welcome to our North Sound Stewards Speaker Series. My name is Destiny Dunbar, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist for Resources. And today our presenter is going to be Max Calloway, who works with Washington's Department of Natural Resources. And he is going to be presenting on bull kelp habitats, benefits, and trends in the Puget Sound area. As I said, this is a part of our North Sound Stewards Speaker Series. Our North Sound Stewards program is jointly run by Resources and the Whatcom Marine Resources Committee, and we just train volunteers and community members to collect marine data. And this is a part of their training, or their listening to these presentations is a part of their training and does count as part of their training hours. So if you are North Sound Stewards, do be sure that you're tracking your hours on Track It Forward. It looks like everybody's muted and has their videos off, so that's great. If you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and type it in the chat box, and Max is going to take these questions as they come. Our speakers are here for you to learn from, so definitely take advantage. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And if you're not able to stay for the whole presentation, it is being recorded, and that recording will be up on our Resources YouTube page. And if you can't search it, which you should be able to, but if you can't find it, we will also be having that link in next month's North Sound Stewards e-news. So thank you for joining us, Max. I'm going to cut off my screen here so we can see yours. I'm going to introduce Max, and then Max, go ahead and take it away. So Max Calloway was raised on the shores of Long Island Sound, where as a child he discovered a love for marine environments while harassing horseshoe crabs at low tide. While working as a field technician for Olympic National Park, he became enamored with the floating forests of bull kelp along the Strait of Juan Islands. This curiosity followed him into his graduate studies at the Evergreen State College Masters of Environmental Studies program, where he focused almost all of his time and effort on understanding the dynamics of Puget Sound bull kelp beds. His graduate work transitioned into a position as a kelp specialist for Puget Sound Restoration Fund, helping expand kelp hatchery facilities and restoration plantings. He now works for Washington's Department of Natural Resources on long-term kelp monitoring and eelgrass restoration projects. So thank you again, Max, for joining us, and feel free to take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Destiny. And yes, so I now work for the Nearshore Habitat Program at DNR. And we have a lot of, it's not just me there. We have a lot of other great folks that, we usually are all pretty collaborative on field stuff and analysis and writing. And so, I'd also like to just thank Helen Berry, Jeff Gakel, Pete Dowdy, Bart Christian, Lisa Ferrier, Melissa Sanchez, and Lauren Johnson, all of whom have probably contributed to parts of what we're going to talk about today. Oh, why aren't you moving? There we go. So this is kind of a rundown of what I thought we would discuss. So just a brief kind of overview of what kelp is and how it works. And then a little bit of kind of the habitat that it provides and what it does and why we really care about it in Puget Sound. And then we're kind of going to zoom out and talk about just kelp worldwide and kind of some of the big declines that have been going on, and zoom back into our region and talk about a little bit of the trends that we've been seeing here. As well as kind of what we think are behind some of the trends that we see. And then I'll finish up by talking a little bit about the conservation planning that's been going on over the past few years. So kelp is a brown seaweed. It's technically a phaeophyte in the order Laminariales. There are other seaweeds that are considered brown seaweeds that are not technically kelp. The two that are most common in our region are rockweed, which most of you are probably familiar with. It's a species of fucus, and it's the one that grows like all over the intertidal. It looks kind of like little mittens. It's brown seaweed, not technically a kelp. The other one is called acid kelp. This grows mostly subtidally. I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it. Anybody who's boated around here would probably be really familiar with it, as it's something that you often pull up with your anchor. It's not a true kelp, and it gets its name because actually some of the cells in its tissue have sulfuric acid in it to deter grazers. So kelp all have this unique life cycle. This is part of what makes a kelp a kelp. Right here is the life cycle for Nereocystis. So you have these giant adult plants, which are technically not plants, because all seaweed is an algae. But that's whatever. It's easier to call them plants. But technically, an adult piece of seaweed is called a sporophyte. And these sporophytes, or the adult plants, produce sorus patches, which are actually parts of the blade that undergo meiosis to produce spores that then germinate into male and female gametophytes, which then reproduce sexually to produce the next generation. And so this is pretty unique, and it also makes it difficult to study kelp in the wild, just because you can imagine, it's hard enough studying microscopic things in the field on land, and then you do that underwater, it gets a lot harder. And so that whole microscopic life stage, we really only know how it works based on laboratory studies. With some, there's been some advances of how we can kind of get a better picture of what's happening in the wild, but it's still really difficult. Kelp comes in three different shapes. The first is prostrate. So this is what you see probably at low tide around the shore. This right here is sugar kelp, or Saccharina latissima. And all prostrate kelps generally just are one big blade and then a very small stipe, which is the stem. And the stipe doesn't produce or provide any sort of like structure. So these are big fronds of kelp that generally just kind of get blown around in the currents and tides. And although like when we see them at low tide, they seem just like very like kind of like almost like a mat of seaweed. When you're underwater and you're completely submerged, some of these plants are 6-9 feet long, and so you actually, when you're underwater, they don't have anything to hold them up, but the currents are moving them around, and so you do get a really dense kind of forest, even with things that you wouldn't necessarily consider to be forest size for humans. You're still thinking about like 2 meters thick sometimes. The other shape is stalked or stipitate kelp. This is a picture of Pterogophora californica, which has no common cutesy name. Generally, it's called stalked kelp, honestly. But it is, stalked kelp, as you can see from the picture, have usually a longer, more rigid stipe, and that is what holds the fronds up above the understory. And so this would generally be producing a mid-story of canopy that's held aloft above all of the prostrate kelp below it. And then, of course, we have kind of the iconic floating kelp. These form the tops of kelp forests, the floating canopies. They're not as common as prostrate kelp or even stipitate kelp in some regions, but they are definitely the most well-known. We all probably know about the giant kelp forests in California. We have giant kelp in our region in the Salish Sea, along our outer coast and into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But as you kind of continue east in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, eventually the macrocystis peters out and you're left only with this species, bull kelp, which is the only floating canopy species that we have in Puget Sound. And these, this is what everybody thinks of when they think of a kelp forest. But as I mentioned earlier, any of these, kind of forms of kelp alone or in combination, really are considered kelp forests. Like I said, even prostrate kelp forests can, be pretty thick, like again, almost 6-9 feet tall and provide a lot of habitat. And that habitat has a huge foundational effect, as well as an engineering effect on the environments in which they grow. They're incredibly productive clade of organisms that their primary productivity rivals that of rainforests and even intensely cultivated agricultural fields. And all of that growth is taking carbon and nutrient out of the water. And so there's a lot of interest, especially now, in using kelp and especially kelp aquaculture for use in ameliorating ocean acidification conditions and also reversing eutrophication. Those kind of uses are the research into that is very new, and there are some promising results, but just from what we know now, it doesn't seem like kelp will be, or anything really for that matter, is a silver bullet to these issues. But with more research, we could really start to understand how exactly they could help in those ways. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the OA stuff a little bit more later. The other kind of engineering that kelp does to the environment is that it entrains water. It slows water that's moving both towards shore and across shore. So in that way, especially with really dense kelp forests, they almost act as a breakwater where they actually dampen wave energy and reduce coastal erosion. And by slowing both across and along shore water movement, it's also trapping more particulates. So you're trapping more invertebrate larvae, you're trapping more particulate matter, which is all really important for, invertebrate abundances, as well as food for filter feeders, such as bivalves. And of course, the kelp itself is food. The number of things that eat fresh kelp directly is smaller than you may think. But kelp is just exporting all of this carbon, which we'll talk about. And so it's getting just dispersed into the environment to provide food elsewhere. All of the structure is an incredibly good refuge and nursery, especially for juvenile fish and small kind of mid-trophic fish that everything wants to eat. And all of this just serves to increase biodiversity. And so, when people talk about like, what do I, like Max, what is the most important thing that kelp does for the environment? I would say it increases biodiversity, because what that does is that you increase ecosystem resiliency, which is something that is going to be incredibly important as we start to see the effects of climate change more and more. But going back to the food, these things are carbon export factories because of all of their productivity. So about 80% of all of the productivity in kelp forests is exported from those kelp forests. They end up in not only sandy and rocky beach habitats, but then they also get transported as floating rafts out into the middle of the ocean. And those rafts eventually sink and almost act kind of as like a less sexy version of a whale fall. It's just some rotting seaweed as opposed to this massive whale carcass that you can film an entire episode of Planet Earth about. But yeah, so that all gets exported. Locally, it's producing and leaching sugars out into the environment, and we're starting to understand that creates this incredibly rich microbiome that's happening on these kelp species, and that differ depending on where they grow. As of now, we don't really know what they do for the kelp or the environment, but we do know that similar microbiomes associated with plant roots are actually really important for transport of nitrogen and all of these other services. And of that 80% of productivity, about 11% of it is sequestered long term. So that is usually kelp that gets either floats away into the middle of the ocean as a raft, or falls into one of these deep ocean trenches that are just off of the continental shelf. And that is kelp that is carbon that is sequestered forever. That carbon is not coming back. So when we think about carbon cycling and how the planet starts to heal from climate change, kelp could actually be one of these natural engines that helps us sink carbon, or it could be a great way that we could figure out how to sink more carbon in the future. And that's a recent paper actually suggested that to combat climate change, it actually made economic sense in some ways to grow a bunch of seaweed for the express purpose of just shipping out over like the Marianas Trench or other deep ocean trenches and just dumping it all down there for long-term sequestration. And like I said, it really helps support food webs that are nearby. So this is a great cartoon from an Australian nonprofit that is just showing all of the myriad benefits that beach wrack has, not only for the nearby fish environments, but also for the terrestrial environments. And this is something we'll come back to later, where especially with fly larvae, we know that certain species of fly are one of the primary and best food sources for juvenile salmon as they're out migrating. And so areas that have a lot of beach wrack are also going to have more of those flies available for foraging. And it goes for the same kind of relationship applies to increase invertebrate abundances for birds and other critters on the beach, and also in the nearshore environment right there at the water's edge. And you can actually calculate how much of this carbon is in other things in the ecosystem. So KDC stands for kelp-derived carbon. So that just means, like, as a percentage of your total biomass, how much of that biomass is ultimately derived from kelp in the marine environment. And you can track this using isotopes. But what I've kind of highlighted out in this big review paper is, we have herring, we have cod, not the same cod we have here, but related. We have our kelp greenling, we have all our rockfish. And you can see these percentages are actually pretty impressive with some of these species with, most of them kind of estimated to be over 30% made of kelp. And that's because, again, it's this foundational species. So all of that productivity that's going out, that we already talked about going out into the environment, then gets absorbed back into the food web and makes its way up to the highest trophic levels. And kind of a brief aside before we delve more into the food web stuff, just thinking a little bit about all that carbon and what's happening with that carbon. On a daily basis, we know that kelp is increasing the pH of the water, but at night it respires. And so that kind of that amelioration is only temporary. And we also know from some recent research by Puget Sound Restoration Fund and DNR also with eelgrass that, that those benefits aren't exported. It's not like these kelp forests or eelgrass beds are acting as water filters where water comes in, gets cleaned, and then that clean water then mixes with the carbon-rich water elsewhere. It's really only local. We do know that in the Strait of Juan de Fuca that the pH is generally elevated inside of kelp forests. But again, you have that strong daily cycle. And so for calcifying organisms that are impacted by OA, the question then becomes, okay, so you have benefits. You have the pH being raised so that there's not going to be as much shell dissolution, but it's only temporary. And new research is starting to uncover that some of these organisms may actually time their growth to take advantage of those better conditions, so that they can kind of stack the deck in their favor by growing only when it's good for them. But again, there haven't been any long-term studies on this, and there's a lot in the kind of popular discourse right now about how kelp farming will solve ocean acidification, and sometimes those I feel like personally those claims are a little bit overblown based on where we are with the science. But that's a little bit of a tangent. The real fun stuff is following the kelp through the food web. And so the next link after all of the detritus is our invertebrates. And we do know, and we have a very good sense that we have increased invertebrate abundances within kelp forests as opposed to in open water adjacent. We know that from the Strait of Juan de Fuca now, where they have actually shown that there are greater abundances of invertebrates, not just generally, but specific species that are important prey species for forage fish and juvenile salmon and rockfish. And from Norway, we know that invertebrate abundances inside of kelp forests are sometimes 5 times higher than even in other nearshore vegetated habitats. So like, eelgrass beds or salt marshes. For our region, these kelp forests and kelp detritus, all of this kind of leaf litter and kind of marine snow that comes down from these forests is incredibly important for pinto abalone. And similar to all of that wrack, not just because of the pH benefits, but also because of the increased water entrainment time, keeping food around longer in the kelp forest, we see increased mussel and barnacle growth rates inside of kelp forests as opposed to outside of them. And all of these invertebrates are perfect prey for all of our forage fish, so our herring, our sand lance, and our surf smelt, all of which are planktivorous. And then you also add the benefit that these kelp forests provide incredibly good refuge and nursery habitat, where we know that all of these species do a lot of their spawning and rearing. And it's basically just the best of both worlds, where these kelp forests not only provide ample hiding locations so that these juvenile forage fish are, I guess, feeling safe, but they also have access to a lot of forage. So they just overall are experiencing less stress when kind of thinking about how much risk to take when looking for food. And so they're actually able to grow a lot faster because there's so much less stress because they have all this great housing and food. The same goes for juvenile rockfish. Young of year rockfish are most often the most abundant fin fish encountered during surveys in kelp forests in our region. And we know from the scientific literature that juveniles like to hide in the floating canopy of bull kelp forests and then slowly move to deeper habitats as they get bigger and bigger. And this is because it allows them to hide from their bigger relatives. Rockfish are known to eat each other. And so if you can stay away from the big fish, you increase your chances of turning into a big fish. And as we already talked about too, these kind of kelp falls in deep ocean environments likely help support adult rockfish populations. In a pretty recent ROV survey that WDFW did with NOAA, they found large aggregation of rockfish around a lot of kelp rack material that had fallen to the bottom of the ocean. So, again, not as cool as the whale fall on planet Earth with all the sharks and everything, but, very similar kind of thing happening potentially. And juvenile salmon also use these kelp forests as refuge. We know that the outmigration period overlaps with peak kelp productivity. As I talked about with finfish, we know early growth in these fish really determines their survivorship. And we also know that juveniles will leave areas with inadequate foraging opportunities. So again, as with the forage fish and juvenile rockfish, you have these habitats that provide ample foraging opportunities with protection. And that protection is not only material in that they're not getting eaten, but with the growing knowledge we have of non-consumptive effects, so just the threat of a predator being nearby, that stress can impact growth rates. And we also just have, we have association data from our region now. There's been some great research in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the same that found those increased invertebrate abundances that also documented increased use of these floating forests by juvenile salmon to hide from larger salmon, similar to with the salmon or with the rockfish. And it, again, as similar with rockfish, we know that these kelp forests are also important for adult salmon. And local traditional and ecological knowledge supports that, without any real need for scientific rigor in some ways. We know that these have always been traditional fishing grounds for Canadian First Nations and Washington tribes. There's a growing body of archaeological evidence that also suggests that the earliest migrants over to the North American continent didn't cross on the land bridge, but crossed using the kind of calm water in between large coastal kelp forests and land, where they could also just easily forage a variety of foods that I think any of us, as kind of more coastal people generally think, clams, fish, all of these things. And all of those species are very much similar from the Pacific Rim all the way down to Chile. So again, thinking of like a forager mindset, it's actually like an easier thing, so you don't have to worry about eating something that might kill you. And that, this kind of link with local people to their kelp forests continues today, where if you look at, a website like Salmon University, which provides fishing tips for local people, people always suggest that if you really want to hook the big coho or the big chinook, that you target the edges of kelp forests. And those two species aren't accidental either. We have similar isotopic data that was used to derive those kelp-derived carbon estimates that also shows that compared to sockeye and pink salmon, Chinook and coho continue to rely on nearshore diets and environments throughout their entire adult life, while sockeye and pink will kind of stick to deeper waters and be more pelagic. And of course, when we talk about Chinook salmon, we're also talking about southern resident killer whales. And with a lot of knowing that Chinook numbers are down, and that's one of the reasons why there have been such trouble with the southern residents, it really really hammers home to me the importance of our nearshore vegetated habitats. But unfortunately, a lot of those habitats, along with these species that we think of as iconic for our region, are a part of this broader biodiversity crisis that is a global crisis. Some of you might remember, I think it was last year or 2 years ago now, there was all of the headlines about 1 million species threatened with extinction. That was from this report that leaked, and that was kind of the attention-grabbing headline. But the real big kind of takeaway from the report is that biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and services are all in decline worldwide. And despite our best efforts to come up with, kind of human or human nature hybrids for these functions and services, many of these are completely irreplaceable. And so it really, kind of starts cascading once you lose these foundational habitats. And we know that southern resident killer whales are a part of this. We know salmon are a part of this. We know eelgrass is a part of this. We know coral reefs are. And, more recently, we're starting to get the picture that this is also affecting kelp forests. This is from 2019. This is based on a huge review of all distribution and trend data for kelp forests globally. And it focuses on studies that are greater than 20 years in length. One of the difficulties with kelp is that it's incredibly fast growing and dynamic. So if you're only monitoring over even like a 5-year scale or a 2-year scale, you really probably aren't going to be capturing the peaks and valleys of natural variation. So these longer studies are really the most accurate way that we can start to see what's happening around the world. And by and large, more regions are losing kelp than gaining kelp. That's true for our region, for California, Northern California for sure. If anybody's paid attention to the news from down there over the past 5 years, they've had like a 90% loss, over 90% loss of their bull kelp forest. But if you look at this tiny little thing, actually this other pie chart is interesting because that I believe represents the DNR aerial photography data that we have of the Strait and Outer Coast, which goes, I believe, all the way back to the 80s or 90s, and does show relative stability in our floating kelp forests in the Strait and Outer Coast. But if you look at this tiny little gray circle here, that's Puget Sound, and there is no data. There is this map was updated from another study from 2016 that specifically mentioned this region as being, or our region, the Salish Sea, as being excluded because of a lack of data. And there is a lack of data, but we have some data. So this represents our best picture, kind of comprehensive snapshot of total understory and floating kelp in our state. This is from the 1999 and 2000 shore zone surveys. It was kind of a cool survey where a biologist and a geologist flew flights along every stretch of coastline and then dictated notes on what they were seeing. And then they went back and classified, GIS data based on those expert classifications from the air, which is just kind of a nerdy, cool thing from a survey method. And you can see just, on the left, we have understory. On the right, we have floating kelp. So in the Strait and Outer Coast, that's Macrocystis and Nereocystis. In the San Juans and Puget Sound proper, it's all Nereocystis. And we do have a lot of understory as compared to canopy, but this is only one snapshot. We don't know what has come before it and what has come after. And that's a big question that we've been asking at DNR, and it ended up getting us to the point of doing comprehensive surveys of total linear extent of bull kelp in both the South Puget Sound in 2017 and then the Central Puget Sound in 2019. And you're looking at our final results for the South Puget Sound, which is below the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, and preliminary results for the Central Puget Sound, which is north of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. We have a manuscript that's hopefully going to come out here sometime this winter or early 2020 that has the full analysis of all of our South Puget Sound data. And we're currently working on a very similar analysis and manuscript for Central Puget Sound. But the goal of this was to see if we could pull out any long-term trends. And so we did these linear extent surveys and then went back into the records all the way back to the 1870s to old navigation charts to try to piece together a historical perspective of what has been happening with kelp, in bull kelp in particular, in Puget Sound. And from our South Sound analysis, we've documented a 60% decrease in overall extent since the 1870s. And you can see that reflected on the map. Just all of the blue is where we have maximum extent. So anywhere kelp has ever been in recorded history, and pink is where it is now. The MRCs, the Northwest Straits Commission's Marine Resource Committees, also help us track trends. This is more limited. They have a subset of beds that they monitor by kayak. But even with this kind of, limited, site-specific surveys, the MRCs have already documented declines, specifically in Snohomish County. And we are most worried about Central and South Puget Sound as far as losses, just based on a lot of anecdotal accounts that people have told us. But there's also growing concern in the San Juan Islands. Oh, and I should say here, what's not represented is Cherry Point. I don't know why it's not in this chart, but up at Cherry Point, the MRCs have also documented declines in the kelp bed there. And so, I can talk a little bit more about why we think we see that, but it's basically temperature. So as you come in from the Strait of Juan de Fuca and go north into the Strait of Georgia or south into Puget Sound, you generally start to see more nutrient-rich and higher water temperatures. And these are the regions where we're starting to see evidence of declines. And that trend is also has shown up in some recent Samish Nation analysis. You can see in the northern islands of the San Juans, the pink here, basically pink shows areas of potential loss. They compared aerial photography from 2006 to aerial photography from 2016. And you can see, there's potential significant losses in the northern islands, close to Cherry Point, and again, in line with that trend that we think there is of increasing water temperatures and decreasing kelp condition. There's a bunch of stuff about why, like nerdy stuff, why this analysis isn't perfect. And I've had a lot of talks with Casey Palmer McGee at the Samish Nation, just about his hopes for this analysis. And they're actually doing a whole new reclassification and comparing it, I think, to 2019 data as well. And I think that should be happening soon. I haven't talked to him recently, though. There is a story map that I've linked to here that does that is the most updated version of this data set and describes exactly what the surveys are. One cool thing about this is that they also incorporated traditional ecologic knowledge. So all of these big kind of green patches are areas where tribal elders have identified where they remember seeing big kelp forests. And again, thinking about this, like, long-term, trend, the fact that we can only go back so far, it is interesting that there are a lot of areas that don't have kelp that, they remember it being there, and is very much in line with what we're seeing from our own historical analysis in the Central and South Puget Sound. We do have some idea of why we might be seeing declines in Puget Sound. Generally, we have some physical and biological stressors that are likely interacting in unpredictable ways. What makes Puget Sound even more difficult is that it is such a complex environment that the main stressors for one area might be different or might be interacting with other stressors that aren't in other areas. And so it really highlights the difficulty in management and conservation in our region where, kind of the whole kelp conservation community understands and acknowledges that, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to kelp conservation in Puget Sound. The biggest one that kind of complicates all stressors is temperature. Most of the species that we have in Puget Sound have similar temperature requirements. And basically, once you get above 15 degrees Celsius, and especially once you get to like 17 degrees Celsius and above, that's when you really start to see some issues. We have documented temperatures within that stress range within kelp forests in South Puget Sound. I'm thinking specifically of Squaxin Island, which is the most southern one here. And we have documented temperatures in excess of 16 and sometimes even 18 degrees Celsius. So we know this might be an issue at local sites. Another often cited example in the literature is nutrient pollution. It's a little counterintuitive because kelp needs nutrients to grow, but too many nutrients create more algal blooms, which actually just deplete nitrogen very quickly, especially during the summer. And that's hard for kelp because obviously that's nitrogen that's being taken away from them. And it's actually hard on the rest of the nearshore environment because those algal blooms increase hypoxic dead zones, which then have cascading effects on the entire ecosystem. There's also a lot of evidence that nutrients alter seaweed competition. All throughout the world, you can see examples there. On the left is an area with healthy kelp forest, and on the right is what that area looks like after the turf algae take over. These turf algae are small, filamentous, bushy algae that are generally associated with lower ecosystem functions and services. And they displace kelp and then trap sediment, which further impedes kelp recovery. And interestingly, all throughout the world, these kind of shifts are correlated with urban development. So you have all of these examples in Western Australia that is from highly populated and embayment. Norway, same thing. Nova Scotia, very similar. And there is one doctorate thesis that suggests that there may be something similar happening around the Seattle waterfront. But again, that's all we know for our region. The other another big stressor that comes out in the literature is sediment, and especially in our region with so much logging and so much land use change that's happened over the centuries. We know that we've altered sediment dynamics. We know that we've built a lot of impervious surfaces along the Puget Sound shoreline, which increases runoff from stormwater. And all of that can, one, decrease light. And that's what you're seeing in that picture on the right. That's when the Elwha Dam was taken out, and all the seaweed actually disappeared for several years following that. And it wasn't until the sediment plume, kind of settled down that enough light made it to the bottom for the kelp to come back. And it actually made a full recovery. What's not pictured here, if anybody's familiar with the region, or if you're not, just to the left of this is an area called Freshwater Bay that has really healthy kelp populations. And so it's likely that kind of reservoir of kelp seed material helped with the recovery just down the way. Sediment, when it's not suspended, can also kill microscopic life stages. So it can either smother them when they've already settled on the substrate or block them from attaching. And then in more urban areas, obviously, there's the potential where the sediment can mobilize pollutants. And that's another area that is not very well studied, where we don't really have a good idea of how common pollutants affect kelp life stages, which is very difficult. On the biotic side of things, we know that we have altered the food web. We know that there has been historic exploitation of a number of species, most of which are high on the food web. So salmon, rockfish, marine mammals. We've also had historic fisheries of cod and pollock. All of these are fish that eat a lot of other things. And we know that when you take predators out, in the famous example of sea otters, urchins explode and deforest whole kelp forests. And we think that there may be something happening here. We don't have urchins in Puget Sound in the way that we would worry about in Oregon or California, or even how managers now are starting to worry in our region, seeing what happened in California with these purple urchin kind of booms, deforesting whole areas. There have been news reports in Oregon kind of with people getting spooked about similar things happening. And managers at WDFW, we've been kind of working with them to start to think about how we can start surveying on the outer coast and outer strait of Juan de Fuca to kind of make sure that we can be ready when this happens, or we can see if this starts happening in our region so that we can be ready. But in Puget Sound, we're not worried about that, maybe in isolated areas. We are worried about other invertebrates. We know that from our own kind of personal experiences and reports from folks that we meet at docks that people generally say that they're seeing more kelp crabs. And we know from lab feeding trials that kelp crabs love bull kelp in particular. We also know from the literature that smaller mesograzers, which are, like snails, other gastropods, limpets, these kind of smaller grazers may have big impacts just because of the fact that while they're not as conspicuous as, say, a kelp crab or an urchin, they're generally much more abundant. But again, this is another area where we really don't have a good understanding of what's happening in Puget Sound. We also have one invasive species that is likely contributing to pushing kelp out, and that is Sargassum uticum. We know that it can displace native species. We suspect that it has been increasing in distribution and abundance, but the only data that we have is that one shore zone inventory. So we just have one snapshot from 2000, and we really don't have a way currently of tracking these things. And so in response to all these stressors, and kind of the fear of losses, there was a kelp recovery plan. The process started in 2017 once the rockfish recovery plan came out, which identified bull kelp forest as critical habitat for the two endangered rockfish species we have. And the first year we focused on kind of what we just went over, understanding the science, figuring out what the stressors were that could be affecting our populations, and trying to figure out where we had gaps in our knowledge. And I think I've been saying a lot during this presentation already, just like, oh, like there's this, we don't know about our region, and we really have a dearth of data on kelp in Puget Sound, which is difficult for anyone who's familiar with how management works, because management and policy have to be based on best available science. And in a lot of cases, we just don't have it right now. The second year was really interesting because we started to move from those gaps to determining priority actions. And we did that with scientists and policymakers to kind of get a real bead on what we know, what we don't know, what would be nice to know, what can be done with the limited amount that we do know. And all of this was done in these workshops that, basically were done on a consensus basis, which was, really nice to see, just having a lot of people from a lot of different organizations all kind of unified behind this one cause. And you can, that kelp recovery plan has come out and is available on the Northwest Straits Commission website. It's linked here. Because of all the gaps, we started from the precautionary principle. So it basically means just because we don't know how bad something is, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing something to protect it. And as we started to get a better understanding of just how little we know specifically about Puget Sound kelp, we realized that this had to be kind of the underlying principle. Otherwise, you know, it would just be a list of, you know, research topics. And there also were some really kind of optimistic things that came out of our meetings with policymakers and managers, which is that, you know, there are a number of existing regulations on the books that afford protection to kelp. Oftentimes, it's in the same sentence as eelgrass. So if you think about the amount of protections that eelgrass are afforded in the environmental arena, you know, really most of those same protections should be being applied to kelp. And so it's really about following up with implementation and doing this kind of outreach and education so that local shoreline managers also know what to be looking out for. And obviously, it made us, you know, pretty keen on trying to do as much as we can to conserve existing beds as opposed to trying to restore beds once they've already been lost. We came down to 6 main goals. So first, we want to understand and reduce stressors. Second, we want to better understand how kelp really supports Puget Sound food web. So strengthening those connections with salmon, strengthening those connections with orca food webs. We obviously need to update our understanding of distribution and trends to understand how much we've been losing, what is natural variation, and things of both same things alike. Designate kelp protected areas, restore kelp forests, and what we're doing right now, which is promoting awareness and engagement. Because one thing that was abundantly clear is that, you know, people understand that kelp is important, but generally people think, you know, seaweed, it's everywhere, it's a weed. But you know, these habitats really are likely in danger in our region and elsewhere. And so, you know, kind of looking forward, this year we did get kelp added as a new vital sign indicator. And we spent this summer expanding at DNR our canopy kelp monitoring protocol. And we were able to visit 13 sites, and there should be a report coming out later this year, just kind of summarizing those findings. And Puget Sound Restoration Fund has completed its first pilot restoration, and they're actually about to implement, I believe, I mean, probably this winter in February, they're going to go try to do their first full-scale restoration. But we still have a lot that we don't know in our region, and that, especially now that budgets are so tight, is definitely going to be a hurdle. You know, trying to convince folks that, you know, we need to be investing more in this resource. But we're all hopeful, and there's some really cool things coming soon, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Max. We do have one question in from Kim. She wants to know, are Canadians working on kelp in Georgia Straits? Do we know how more northerly kelp beds are doing? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, there's a couple folks working on restoration up there. I don't know where that project is. Puget Sound Restoration Fund was in contact with them while they were developing their methods and everything. And as far as trends, I'm not super familiar with long-term monitoring and trends, but there are concerns of losses, you know, kind of right there at the entrance of Strait of Georgia, and as you go north, just from temperature modeling. But yeah, I'm not as familiar with the actual trend data.
Okay. I had a question. I'm sorry if you already covered this about turf algae, and you said it was connected with urban development. And I'm curious what the connection to urban development is with algae.
So yeah, it's mostly just because of, well, it's difficult. Initially, because turf algae stuff is like a new kind of thing. Like people started seeing this, or started really noticing and documenting it probably like the mid 2000 teens. And there have been a number of laboratory studies where they've like elevated carbon and nitrogen and temperatures to see if any of these things you know, give turf an upper hand. And basically turf do better than kelp under elevated temperatures, elevated nutrients, and elevated carbon. And so the idea is that you tend to have like those things are all tend to be associated with urbanization, because you have less shading of the water, you have more runoff, and you have a lot more effluent. But there's similar stuff is happening in Nova Scotia, and it's continuing to happen, even though over the past, like I think when you look at the long-term trends, they've been decreasing the amount of nutrients that are entering the nearshore, and yet turf is continuing to expand. And some researchers are starting to get worried that it might just be temperature alone and not the associated, effluent, or like, anthropogenic, usually effluent associated nitrogen.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. Do we have any more questions? If you do, go ahead and type them in the chat. I had one more question. There was one species, it was an invasive species of kelp. And I'm just curious, I know how invasive species kind of move around on land, but I'm curious how invasive species move around in water.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really similar. I believe Sargassum uticum is a Japanese species, and I think this is one of the species that they think came over in like bilge water. So it's just like if you remember the kind of the diagram of the life cycle, they produce spores that just kind of float around. And so the thing about Sargassum is that it's now that it's here, and I'm pretty sure it was one of the ones that was brought over with either bilge water or just like a hitched a ride on like an anchor chain or something, one of those crazy stories. But now that it's here, it's basically competing with all of our native species, and it leafs out, so it's perennial, right? So like this bushy thing that we're seeing in the picture, that all dies back in the winter. But then it like leafs out, whereas other kelp species, if you remember that, I guess I can go all the way back. If you remember that diagram, they have this alternate life history where, go all the way back. They have this alternate life history. One thing I didn't mention is that, just like regular plants, some kelp are perennial and some are annual. A species like bull kelp is annual. So this, like, it dies back, it dies back sometimes completely in the winter. And so there's something happening with this microscopic life stage in the winter, and then it shows back up again in the spring. There are a number of perennial kelp species, but they only last a few years. And again, they go through this phase of needing to go through this microscopic life stage. Sargassum has a perennial stipe, and so it just needs to leaf out every spring. So it can get, it basically has a head start on our native species, and it shades them out and then produces its spores, and then its spores can continue to kind of leapfrog along.
Okay, all right, thank you for that.
Yeah. Oh, Sargassum also floats. So it's another one of these that can get detached and then float. And, bull kelp does it, giant kelp does it, where these rafts will actually continue to grow and continue to produce spores as they float along.
Okay, yeah. We have one. Any recommendations on what we can do locally in Whatcom County to protect and restore our kelp beds? We are going through a shoreline management program right now. So
yeah, I mean, I think definitely, and this is something that's come up with kind of more discussion on how we're going to continue to kind of work on kelp conservation and recovery. One of the things that's come up a lot is, working with coastal zone managers on the county level. Because as I mentioned, one of the big messages that we got from Department of Ecology, and that we also found, like, just as we were doing the research to write the plan, is that, there are a lot of existing protections for kelp, and that, there's no real sense of how well those regulations have been and are continuing to be implemented in the context of kelp. And so that's just kind of another one of these gaps, but also would provide us with better information on, like, are there things that are being done? And if so, can we start to ask the question, how effective they are, or are there a number of things that just because people tend to be more eelgrass focused, just because of, you know, a number of reasons, you know, are there things that where kelp is like slipping through the cracks almost? And so I would say if you're in Whatcom County, getting involved with the Marine Resource Committee, if you're not already involved with them, and definitely, you know, Northwest Straits Commission, because they're basically spearheading a lot of this, and they, you know, we're talking with our partners at the Northwest Straits Commissions about these kind of like, do we want to do like a coastal zone manager like workshop, or, you know, like what's the best way to kind of start to do more of this outreach and education on the local level?
Definitely, yeah. And North Sound Stewards, we are jointly run, it's resources and the Whatcom Marine Resource Center, or
Oh,
committee.
wonderful.
Yeah. And I
Cool.
do think one of our programs is kelp monitoring. So
Yeah.
we are doing a bit on that front.
Yeah, the Cherry Point data is from, yeah, I always forget where the counties are, but I think the Cherry Point data is from Whatcom.
Okay, it looks like we have no more questions and it is just about time. So Max, thank you so much for your presentation. And for the folks who came in late, this is recorded. You can find it on our resources YouTube channel, and we'll also have it as a link on our next North Sound Stewards e-news. Yes, thank you. So
yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And folks, remember to track your hours on Track It Forward. And with that, everybody, you have a wonderful evening.
Thanks. Good night.